Hey guys, and welcome. Tonight we're going to drift back in time to a place of profound beauty and equally profound danger. We're traveling to feudal Japan, a world of silk kimonos and sharpened steel, of whispered poetry and silent, deadly resolve. We're here to get to know some of the most fascinating and often overlooked figures in history, the women of the samurai class, the Onna-musha. These weren't just wives and mothers waiting for their husbands to come home from the battlefield. They were educated, powerful, and in many cases formidable warriors in their own right. Their story is one of incredible resilience, of navigating a world with a rulebook that was both incredibly rigid and constantly being rewritten in blood. As always, if you find some comfort in what I do here, a simple click on the like or subscribe button is always deeply appreciated. It lets me know you're out there, listening in the quiet of the night, and I'm always curious. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's a wonderful thought to know we have this quiet little community, spread out all across the globe, all settling in together. But that's enough of that. The journey awaits. So now is the time. Dim the lights, pull the covers up just a little bit higher, find that perfect spot on your pillow. Let your breathing slow down and your shoulders relax. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Just be here, and let's ease into our story together. Chapter 1. The world of silk and shadow, society, duty, and the Buke woman. To understand a woman who could compose a delicate poem about the falling cherry blossoms in the morning, and competently wield a 10-foot polearm in the afternoon, we first have to understand the world that created her. We have to walk through the paper screen walls of her home, understand the very air she breathed, which was thick with duty, honor, and a constant humming tension. This wasn't a world of individual ambition, not in the way we think of it. It was a world built around one central, all-powerful concept, the I.E., the household, the clan. Before we get to the clan, though, let's set the stage. For centuries, Japan had been ruled from the top down by an emperor in Kyoto, a divine figure who was more of a spiritual leader than a political one. The real power was held by an elegant, sophisticated, and frankly somewhat detached court nobility. They were the masters of high culture, the connoisseurs of art, poetry, and intricate ceremony. But while they were busy perfecting the art of a 12-layered silk robe, or debating the precise nuance of a single word in a poem, something was happening out in the provinces. A new class of people was rising. These were the warriors, the Buke as they were known. Initially, they were little more than hired muscle for the absentee aristocrats in the capital. They were the practical, hardened men tasked with managing sprawling rural estates, collecting taxes, and putting down the occasional peasant rebellion. They lived on the land, they understood its rhythms, and they understood power, not as something debated in a perfumed court, but as something that grew from the end of a sword and the loyalty of the men standing beside you. And over time, as the central government in Kyoto became more and more absorbed in its own refined world, the Buke began to realize something. They were the ones with the weapons. They were the ones with the organized manpower. They were the ones holding all the practical cards. And so slowly at first, and then with the force of a tidal wave, power shifted. The age of the courtier gave way to the age of the samurai. This is the world our Onna-musha is born into. A world where your family name, your clan, is everything. Your personal feelings, your dreams, your desires, they were, to be polite, a secondary consideration, a luxury even. The primary unit of existence was not the self, but the I.E., and the I.E. was not just a family. You have to imagine it less like a cozy household, and more like a modern corporation, a dynasty, a small nation-state, all unto itself. Every single member, from the most powerful lord down to the lowest-ranking servant, had a specific role to play in the survival and prosperity of this corporate entity. And the stakes weren't a poor quarterly report, or a dip in the stock market. The stakes were total annihilation. Your neighboring clan, the Tanakas, weren't just your friendly rivals. They were a competing firm that would, if given the slightest opportunity, enact a hostile takeover that involved burning your castle to the ground and seizing all your assets, which in this case was your land and your life. Loyalty wasn't just a virtue, it was the fundamental operating principle of the universe. Betrayal wasn't just wrong, it was a catastrophic failure that could erase your entire lineage from history. So, where does a high-born woman fit into this high-stakes corporate drama? Her role was absolutely central. While the men were the public face of the clan's power, the warriors, the generals, the diplomats meeting in formal halls, the women were the spine, They were the managers, the educators, the keepers of the household's integrity and continuity. The lord of the clan might have been the CEO, but his wife was the chief operating officer, the one who made sure the entire complex machinery of the household actually ran. Let's step inside the home, forget the brutal, muddy battlefields for a moment, and picture the heart of a samurai estate. It's a place of quiet, ordered beauty, polished wooden floors, so clean you could see your reflection. Shoji screens made of delicate rice paper that slide open to reveal perfectly manicured gardens where every rock and plant is placed with deep symbolic meaning. The air smells of tatami mats, old wood, and the faint, clean scent of incense. This is the woman's domain, the world of silk. From a very young age, a girl of the Buke class was immersed in an education of profound refinement. This wasn't about preparing her for a career, but about molding her into an asset for her clan. She would learn calligraphy, the art of the brush, and this was more than just learning to write. It was a discipline of mind and body, the way you ground the ink, the way you held the brush, the pressure and flow of a single stroke. It all revealed your character, your discipline, your inner state. A poorly written character was a sign of a disordered mind. A masterful piece of calligraphy was a statement of grace, control, and good breeding. She would learn the intricate art of the tea ceremony, Channyoryu. Again, this was a universe of meaning disguised as a simple act. Every gesture was prescribed, from how you folded the silk cloth to wipe the bowl, to how you whisked the green tea into a perfect foam. It was a moving meditation, a practice in mindfulness and hospitality. Hosting a tea ceremony was a way of honoring a guest, of creating a moment of pure, uncluttered peace in a world that was anything but. It was a subtle display of her culture and her clan's sophistication. She would study poetry, particularly the short, evocative forms like waka, and later, haiku. She had to be able to not only understand the classics, but to compose her own, often in an instant. Poetry wasn't just a hobby, it was the primary language of sophisticated communication. A well-crafted poem could convey a message of political alliance, a subtle warning, a declaration of love, or a heartbreaking lament, all masked in beautiful natural imagery. It was the text message and the diplomatic cable of its day, all rolled into one. A woman who could wield words with precision and grace was a woman who could navigate the complex social currents of her time. And of course she learned music, how to play the koto, a long-stringed zither, or the baiwa, a type of lute. She learned the art of flower arranging, ikebana, where the empty space is just as important as the flowers themselves. Now, it's easy for us, from our modern perspective, to look at this and see a life of beautiful, but ultimately powerless ornamentation. We see a woman being trained to be a lovely, cultured object, but that would be a profound misunderstanding. Every single one of these feminine arts was, in reality, a tool of power. They were the soft skills of diplomacy, influence, and psychological management. Calligraphy demonstrated control. The tea ceremony built relationships. Poetry conveyed coded messages. These were not the pastimes of a woman with nothing to do. This was the training of a diplomat and a manager, someone who had to command respect and exert influence, not through brute force, but through impeccable grace and unshakable inner calm. This was the silk part of her identity, but it was a silk that was as strong as any armor, because all this training, all this cultivation of grace and refinement, was leading towards one, almost inevitable event: her marriage. If you think dating is stressful today, just take a moment to appreciate the concept of the samurai political marriage. It had absolutely nothing to do with love, romance, or personal compatibility. A marriage between the children of two powerful samurai clans was a strategic alliance, pure and simple. It was a merger, a non-aggression pact, a treaty sealed not with ink on a scroll, but with a human being. A young woman, often just a teenager, would be sent away from her home, from everyone she had ever known, to live in the fortress of a potential rival. Her duty was twofold. First, she was to produce an heir, securing the future of her husband's clan. This was her absolute, non-negotiable prime directive. The pressure to produce a healthy son was immense, as the entire future of the clan rested on it. But her second duty was just as critical. She was an ambassador for her birth family. She was their eyes and ears inside her new home. Her very presence was a constant reminder of the alliance between the two clans. She had to navigate this incredibly delicate position, balancing loyalty to her new husband and his family with the interests of the family she came from. Imagine the psychological tightrope she had to walk. She had to win the trust and respect of her new family, especially her mother-in-law, who was often the reigning power within the household's domestic sphere. She had to manage servants who might be suspicious of her, and she had to advise her husband, subtly steering him in ways that would benefit both his clan and her own. A misplaced word, a sign of disrespect, a perceived wavering in her loyalty, any of it could have disastrous consequences, potentially unraveling the alliance and plunging both families into war. She was a diplomat in a permanent high-stakes foreign posting, and her own happiness was the very last thing on the agenda. But once established in her new home, and assuming she succeeded in this delicate balancing act, the samurai woman's power would grow significantly. As the lady of the castle, she took on the colossal task of managing the household, and again, we have to adjust our modern idea of what a household is. This wasn't just a matter of planning menus and telling the staff to dust the furniture. This was managing a massive, complex logistical operation. She was responsible for the entire domestic economy of the estate. This meant managing the food supplies, the vast stores of rice, millet, vegetables, and pickled goods that had to feed not only the family, but hundreds, sometimes thousands of samurai retainers, soldiers, and servants. She had to oversee the budgets, keeping meticulous accounts of every bit of income and expenditure. She managed the production of textiles like silk and cloth, the brewing of sake, and the maintenance of the buildings themselves. If you think managing your personal finances is a headache, imagine being the CFO of a military encampment that was also a noble court and a small town, all in one. She was also the head of human resources. She was responsible for the training, discipline, and welfare of all the other women and servants in the castle. She had to be a shrewd judge of character, knowing who to trust, who to promote, and who to watch carefully. In a world of shifting allegiances and constant intrigue, a disloyal servant could be a spy who could bring the entire clan crashing down. And perhaps most importantly, she was the primary educator of the children. She was responsible for instilling in her sons the values of the samurai code: courage, loyalty, honor, and a complete disregard for their own death. She taught them their first lessons, shaped their characters, and prepared them for a life of service and battle. She would oversee their formal education, choosing their tutors in literature, strategy, and the martial arts. And she would teach her daughters how to be like her, how to be refined, intelligent, and strong enough to become the COO of another clan someday. She was the vessel through which the clan's culture, values, and very identity were passed to the next generation. So while her husband was out on the battlefield or in political meetings, dealing with the external threats to the IA, she was the one guarding its heart. She was the center of stability in a world of chaos. She ensured that no matter what happened outside the castle walls, inside them, there was order, there were provisions, and the next generation was being forged. The men fought to protect the clan, but the women were the ones who ensured there was a clan worth protecting. This division of labor, the outer world for the men, the inner world for the women, might sound restrictive, but within that inner world, the woman's authority was often absolute. She wielded enormous practical power. A visiting samurai might be terrified of her husband's wrath, but he would be just as careful not to offend his wife, the woman who controlled all the resources of the castle and held immense influence over its lord. However, this life of silk and shadow, of managing from behind the scenes, was only one half of the equation, because the world of the Buke was fundamentally unstable. War was not a distant possibility. It was an ever-present reality. A peaceful province could be thrown into chaos in a matter of days. A trusted ally could turn into a mortal enemy overnight. Castles were not just homes, they were fortresses, designed to withstand siege. And in a siege, the line between the inner world of the woman and the outer world of the man dissolved completely. When the warning gongs rang and the enemy's banners appeared on the horizon, the household manager had to become a military commander. The quiet, refined lady of the castle had to be ready to pick up a weapon and defend her home to the death. This is the critical paradox of the Onna-musha. She was raised in a world of art and poetry, taught to value grace and subtlety, but she was also a member of the warrior class, and that meant that violence was her birthright too. From a young age, alongside her lessons in calligraphy and the tea ceremony, a samurai daughter was also trained in the martial arts. She wasn't expected to ride out on cavalry charges with the men, at least not typically. Her martial role was primarily defensive. She was the last line of defense for the castle. Her weapon of choice was often the naginata, a long pole with a curved blade at the end. It was a perfect weapon for home defense. Its length allowed a smaller person to keep a stronger, sword-wielding attacker at a distance. It was excellent for sweeping at the legs of armoured opponents or dismounting cavalrymen who might breach the gates. From a position on the castle walls or defending a narrow hallway, a group of women skilled with the naginata would be a terrifyingly effective fighting force. She also learned to use the kaiken, a small dagger that was always tucked into the sleeves of her kimono. This was her constant companion. It was a weapon of last resort, for close quarters fighting, if an enemy got past her polearm, but it also had a darker, more solemn purpose. It was the tool for jigai, ritual suicide. For a samurai woman, capture by the enemy was a fate worse than death. It would bring dishonour to both her and her clan. If the castle was about to fall, if all hope was lost, she was expected to take her own life with the kaiken, cutting the arteries in her neck to die with her honour intact. This grim reality was part of her education from the beginning. Her life belonged to the clan, and so did her death. This is the world that created the female samurai, a world that demanded she be two things at once. She had to be silk, graceful, cultured, diplomatic, the serene and stable heart of the clan, and she had to be steel, disciplined, resilient, courageous, and ready to kill or die for that same clan without a moment's hesitation. Her life was a delicate and often exhausting balancing act. She lived in a patriarchal society that placed enormous constraints on her, yet it also gave her immense responsibility, and in her own sphere, immense power. She was defined by her duty to her father, her husband, and her son. But through that very duty, she found her strength and her purpose. She wasn't fighting for personal glory. She was fighting for the I, for the name, the land, the ancestors, and the future generations. As we go deeper into this series, we will meet specific women who not only lived this life, but who shattered expectations, who led armies, who ruled provinces, and whose names became legends. But we must always remember that they came from this place. They were forged in this crucible of duty, where the stroke of a calligraphy brush and the slash of a naginata were just two different expressions of the same unwavering commitment to the clan. The world of silk and shadow wasn't a cage, it was a training ground. And the women who mastered it were among the most formidable people of their time. They were the quiet, steady anchor of samurai society, and the hidden wellspring of its strength. Chapter 2. The Forging of Steel. Education of a Warrior. That hidden wellspring of strength wasn't a matter of chance, of course. It wasn't some innate, mystical quality that the women of the samurai class were simply born with. It was forged. It was manufactured with the same deliberate care and relentless pressure that a master smith uses to fold steel, hammering out impurities, heating and quenching the soul until it was both flexible and unbreakable. The crucible of duty we spoke of wasn't just a metaphor for the home. It was a very real, very demanding training program that began almost as soon as a young girl could walk. The world of silk and shadow was indeed a training ground, and the curriculum was written in both ink and blood. The education of a samurai's daughter was a study in profound, and to our modern eyes, jarring contradictions. Her hands were taught to be instruments of immense grace and terrifying violence, often in the same afternoon. One moment she would be learning the delicate art of ikebana, the spiritual practice of flower arranging, understanding how a single perfect blossom could represent the entire universe. She would learn to create harmony from asymmetry, to find beauty in empty space. Her fingers, which had to be so sensitive to the texture of a petal, would then, perhaps an hour later, be wrapped around the cold, unforgiving oak shaft of a weapon taller than she was. This wasn't seen as a contradiction to them. It was two sides of the same coin. The focus and discipline required to create a flawless line of calligraphy with a brush and ink were the very same focus and discipline needed to draw a perfect arc with a blade through the air. One created beauty. The other created a space where beauty could exist, safe from the chaos outside. Both were acts of control. Both were acts of service to the clan. The primary reason for this martial education wasn't what we might imagine today. This wasn't a progressive movement for gender equality. It was born of the most brutal pragmatism imaginable. Samurai lords were, by profession, frequently absent. They were off on campaigns, settling disputes with their neighbours in the most permanent way possible, or attending to duties at the shogun's court. This could last for months, even years, and during that time their castle, their lands, their entire legacy was left behind. The castle was not just a home, it was the clan's headquarters, its treasury, its symbolic heart, and a lordless castle was a very tempting target for an ambitious rival. So who was left to defend it? The men who were too old, too young, or not fit enough for the main campaign, certainly. A skeleton crew of retainers, but the final, absolute last line of defense was the women of the household. When the outer walls were breached, when the professional soldiers had fallen, when the enemy was pouring into the courtyards and corridors of the home itself, it was the ladies of the castle who were expected to hold the line. They were the bloody, unyielding immune system of the fortress. Their training wasn't a hobby or a form of genteel exercise. It was preparation for the absolute worst day of their lives, a day they prayed would never come, but for which they had to be ready, every single moment. Their training began early. Often around the same time a young boy would begin his, but the curriculum was different, tailored to their specific and terrifyingly intimate role. While a boy was trained for the open battlefield, for cavalry charges and grand formations, a girl was trained for the close, desperate confines of the home. She was learning corridor fighting. She was learning how to defend a doorway, a staircase, a nursery. Her battlefield was the place she also practiced the tea ceremony. Every polished hallway was also a potential killing ground. Every paper screen a place an enemy might burst through. This imbued her entire world with a strange and constant dual purpose. The home was a sanctuary to be protected, but it was also a weapon to be used. She learned its angles, its choke points, its hidden paths, not just as a mistress of the house, but as its resident guerrilla commander. The central pillar of this education was the mastery of a weapon that is, to this day, almost synonymous with the Onna-musha, the naginata. To call it a polearm or a halberd is technically correct, but it misses the point entirely. The naginata was a work of art, a masterpiece of martial engineering, born from a deep understanding of physics and anatomy. Imagine a gracefully curved, single-edged sword blade about 2 feet long, mounted on a long, sturdy oak shaft. The entire weapon could be anywhere from 5 to 8 feet in length, often customized to the height and strength of the wielder. In the hands of a trained woman, the naginata was not a clumsy spear. It was a fluid, elegant extension of her own body. Its length was its genius. For a person of smaller stature and less upper body mass, facing down a larger, armored male opponent, armed with a sword, the naginata was the great equalizer. The goal of a sword fighter is to close the distance, to get inside your opponent's guard, and deliver a decisive blow. The entire purpose of the naginata was to make that impossible. It created what you might call a zone of absolute denial, a lethal circle with a radius of 6 or 7 feet, which no sane person would willingly enter. The wielder could stay at a safe distance, using sweeping circular motions to attack an opponent's legs, arms and neck, while remaining well out of reach of his sword. It didn't rely on brute force. It was a weapon of leverage, momentum, and wicked sharp steel, a spinning, slashing blur that could cripple an opponent before he ever got close. It was perfect for defending the narrow confines of a castle. A single Onna-musha with a naginata could hold a hallway against several attackers, the long shaft and flashing blade creating a near-impenetrable barrier. Training with it was a grueling, lifelong commitment. It began with a wooden replica, heavier and more awkward than the real thing, to build the necessary strength in the wrists, shoulders and core. A young girl would spend countless hours in the castle's garden or a private dojo, practicing the kata, the prescribed sequences of movements. These were not random swings, they were a dance of death, a physical vocabulary where every step, every turn, every sweep of the blade had a specific purpose. There was the sweeping cut to the knee to bring a charging opponent down, the quick upward thrust to the throat, the clever hooking motion with the back of the blade to unbalance a foe or snag their weapon. The physical toll was immense. Think of the most demanding full-body workout you can imagine. A combination of Pilates, weightlifting and ballet, and then add a heavy 8-foot pole to it. The muscles in her back and shoulders would burn. Her hands would be covered in calluses from gripping the oak shaft. Her feet would learn a complex dance of pivots and slides, maintaining perfect balance as she spun and lunged. But it was more than just physical. The endless repetition of the kata was a form of moving meditation. It was designed to bypass conscious thought, to embed the movement so deeply into her muscle memory that she could react without thinking, her body knowing what to do long before her mind had time to feel fear. You can almost picture it, the quiet of a manicured garden in the early morning, mist still clinging to the raked gravel. A young woman, perhaps 16, her hair tied back, dressed in simple, practical robes. The only sound is the rhythmic swish of the wooden blade cutting through the damp air, the soft crunch of her feet on the ground. and her own controlled breathing. She moves through the forms, her face a mask of serene concentration. To a casual observer, it might look like a beautiful dance, but she is not dancing. She is methodically, patiently, turning herself into a lethal instrument. She is rehearsing for a performance where a single misstep means death. The curriculum didn't stop with the elegant sweep of the naginata. However, life and battle are rarely so accommodating as to keep your enemies at a polite distance. What happens when an attacker gets past that circle of death? What happens when the fighting is hand-to-hand, in a collapsed corridor, or when you've been grappled and thrown to the floor? For these intimate, terrifying moments, she had another, far more personal tool, the kaiken. The kaiken was a short dagger, typically around 6 to 10 inches long, single or double-edged, and carried in a simple mounting. It was the constant companion of women of the samurai class. It was tucked into the sleeves of their kimono, or secured in their wide belt, the obi. It was as much a part of their daily attire as a hairpin, and its presence was a quiet, constant statement. The statement was, "Do not mistake my grace for weakness. Do not assume I am helpless." If the naginata was a weapon of space and control, the kaiken was a weapon of shocking, brutal efficiency. Training in its use, known as tanto jutsu, was a stark contrast to the flowing grace of the naginata. It was all about short, powerful, decisive movements, stabbing, slashing, targeting the vulnerable points of the human body that armor didn't cover: the throat, the armpits, the inside of the thigh, the eyes. A woman would learn how to use her entire body weight to drive the small blade home. She would learn how to fight from the ground, how to turn an attacker's own momentum against them. It was, what we might politely call, a tool for resolving disagreements at very close range. Its small size made it easy to conceal, and lightning fast to deploy. A seemingly compliant, defeated woman could, in a split second, produce a blade and end the threat. It was the ultimate surprise, the final trick up the sleeve, quite literally. But the kaiken had a darker, more profound purpose, one that was drilled into the mind of a samurai's daughter from a very young age. It was not just a weapon of defense, it was also the instrument for her final duty, should that day ever come. It was the tool for jigai. Jigai was the form of ritual suicide practiced by women of the samurai class. It was the philosophical counterpart to the male ritual of seppuku. While a man would cut his own abdomen, a woman's ritual was different, designed to be, in their view, more discreet, and to preserve a final stoic dignity. If the castle had fallen, if her husband and sons were dead, if capture and dishonor were inevitable, she was expected to take her own life. This wasn't seen as a surrender. It was the ultimate act of defiance. It was a way to rob the enemy of their prize. Capture for a noblewoman could mean a fate far worse than a quick death, a life of shame and servitude, a political pawn, a symbol of her family's utter defeat. Jigai was the final assertion of control in a world that had stripped all other control away. She was taught the exact method. She would find a quiet, private room. She would kneel in the formal Caesar position. Crucially, she would take a cord and bind her ankles or knees together. This was a point of grim practicality, to ensure that her body would be found in a dignified position after death. Then, using the kaiken, she would make a swift, deep cut across her own throat, severing the carotid artery. It was designed to be quick, decisive, and final. Imagine the psychological weight of this knowledge, to carry the instrument of your own potential death with you every single day, to know the precise clinical steps you would have to take. It required a level of mental fortitude that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. The blade tucked into her kimono was a constant, silent reminder of her dual purpose: to defend life fiercely, and to take her own with unwavering resolve if duty demanded it. It was the physical embodiment of her entire education, an education in both the preservation and the relinquishment of life. This forging of the mind was, in many ways, more important than the physical training. A warrior without a steeled will is just a person with a sharp object. The psychological conditioning of an Onna-musha was relentless. She was steeped in the ideals of Bushido, the way of the warrior, but her interpretation of it was unique. A male samurai's Bushido was often focused on battlefield glory, on making a name for himself, on dying an honorable death in the heat of combat. Her Bushido was quieter, more defensive, more internal. It was about endurance. It was about loyalty, not to a distant lord, but to the immediate family, to the home. Her honor was tied not to personal fame, but to the preservation of the clan's legacy. To cultivate this mental state, her education was rich and varied. She studied classic literature and poetry, not as a leisure activity, but as a way to train her mind. Reciting poems in the face of stress was a technique to achieve a state of calm detachment. She studied strategy, reading texts like Sun Tzu's The Art of War, learning to think tactically, not just about battles but about household politics and intrigue. She would be drilled in the Zen Buddhist concept of Fudo-shin, the immovable mind. This is the state of being utterly present, of having a mind like a calm, clear pool of water that reflects everything, but is disturbed by nothing. It's the ability to face a charging enemy, a burning house, or a personal tragedy with the same serene, unshakable core. The tea ceremony, the calligraphy, the flower arranging, these weren't just ladylike hobbies. They were practical exercises in achieving Fudoshin. They demanded absolute focus, precision, and a calm heart. They were training her mind to find stillness in the midst of chaos, a skill that was just as valuable as knowing how to block a sword cut. So we have this incredible duality, a woman who could discuss the nuances of a 1,000-year-old poem in one breath, and in the next explain the most efficient way to sever a femoral artery, a woman whose hands could coax a beautiful melody from a koto, and also expertly wield an 8-foot blade. This was not a contradiction to her, it was completeness. She was trained to be the cultural and spiritual heart of the clan, and also its final, most devoted guardian. The training was constant, woven into the fabric of her daily life. Every chore had a lesson in mindfulness, every social interaction a lesson in observation and diplomacy. She was always learning, always preparing. It's a stark contrast to our modern idea of me time, or work-life balance. For the Onna-musha, her entire life was work, her very existence was a performance of duty, and when the moment came, the blare of war horns, the screams in the courtyard, the smell of smoke, she was expected to put aside the silk and the poetry, and take up the steel. She would tie back the long sleeves of her kimono, pick up the naginata that leaned always ready in a corner of her room, and walk calmly towards the sound of the fighting. She was not a hysterical victim. She was the mistress of the house, and she was about to do her job. The home that she had so carefully managed, the place of beauty and order she had cultivated, was now a fortress, and she, its last warrior queen, was prepared to defend it to her last breath, and if necessary, beyond. The steel of her blade was sharp, but the steel of her will, forged over a lifetime of discipline and duty, was infinitely sharper. That was the true weapon she possessed. Chapter 3. The Crucible of War. The Onna-musha on the battlefield. The home that she had so carefully managed, the place of beauty and order she had cultivated, was now a fortress, and she, its last warrior queen, was prepared to defend it to her last breath, and if necessary, beyond. The steel of her blade was sharp, but the steel of her will, forged over a lifetime of discipline and duty, was infinitely sharper. That was the true weapon she possessed. But the defense of the home, as visceral and absolute as it was only one theatre of war. It was a reaction, a final desperate stand, and the Onna-musha was not always a creature of desperation. Sometimes she was a creature of the open field. Sometimes the fortress she defended was not her house, but her lord's cause, and the ground she held was not a polished veranda, but a blood-soaked patch of some forgotten plain. The leap from defender of the hearth to warrior in the field is a profound one. It's the difference between protecting what is yours and actively seeking to take what belongs to another. It's the transition from a duty born of place to a duty born of allegiance, and it's here, in the chaotic, muddy and profoundly public arena of open battle, that the story of the Onna-musha becomes both legendary and frustratingly difficult to pin down, because this is where history and epic poetry begin to bleed into one another, creating figures who are almost too incredible to be real, yet too persistent to be entirely dismissed. Let's start with the one you've probably heard of, the name that echoes through the centuries like a perfectly struck temple bell, Tomo Gozen. If you were to create a warrior in a character generator and max out every single stat, you'd end up with someone like Tomo. She gallops out of the pages of the Tale of the Heike, the great war epic chronicling the Genpei War of the late 12th century, and she is less a person and more a force of nature. The Heike Monogatari doesn't introduce her with half measures. It tells us she was a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god, on horseback or on foot. She was a rider of untamed horses, an archer of unparalleled skill, and when she drew her heavy, broad-bladed sword, she was, to put it mildly, a significant problem for anyone on the opposing side. The text describes her as beautiful, too fair skin, long black hair, a charming face, the complete package. It's almost as if she were designed in a laboratory to be the perfect warrior maiden icon. She served a lord named Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a man with a famously fiery temper and a rather unfortunate knack for making powerful enemies. Tomo was one of his most trusted commanders. The epic paints these incredible vignettes of her in battle. In one, she rides at the head of a charge, her long sleeves pinned back, her naginata held at the ready. She wasn't just a participant, she was often an instigator. She would ride into the thick of the enemy, find their strongest, most vaunted champion, and proceed to, in the most respectful samurai terms, dismantle him. One of the most famous stories involves her final battle alongside Yoshinaka. His forces are shattered, defeat is certain, and only a handful of his retainers remain. He turns to Tomo and tells her to flee. It would be shameful for him, he says, to be killed in the company of a woman. Now, your modern interpretation might see this as a slight, a moment of chauvinism, but in the context of the time, it was a complex act. He could have been trying to save her, to preserve her life, or he was protecting his own honor, his bushido, which dictated the precise manner in which a lord ought to meet his end. Tomo, being Tomo, does not simply ride away. She is insulted. She tells him she wants to fight one last battle, to show him what a fine warrior she is, so he has something to be proud of in the afterlife. She then scans the battlefield, which is a bit like scanning a menu for the most challenging dish. She spots a famous enemy strongman, a man renowned for his Herculean physique, riding with a troop of 30 men. She wheels her horse, charges directly at him, rides straight up alongside him, grabs him with incredible strength, and drags him from his saddle. She then pins him against the pommel of her own saddle, and in one swift, brutal motion cuts off his head. Then, and only then, does she cast off her armor and ride away, disappearing from the pages of history as dramatically as she entered them. It's an incredible story. It's the kind of scene that makes you want to stand up and cheer. But here, as our wry bedtime storyteller, we have to gently apply the brakes. Is it true? The short, unsatisfying answer is, we don't know for sure. The tale of the Heike is not a dry, factual military report. It's an epic poem, closer to Homer's Iliad than to a modern historical text. It was recited by blind monks, accompanied by the playing of a biwa, designed to entertain, to inspire, and to convey the Buddhist concept of impermanence. Its characters are often archetypes, their deeds exaggerated for dramatic effect. There is no other contemporary record of a Tomo Gozen serving Yoshinaka. This has led many historians to believe she might be a literary creation, a composite of several real warrior women, or perhaps an invention designed to add a splash of colour and romance to the brutal tale of the Genpei War. She might have been a way for the storytellers to explain how Yoshinaka, a supposedly great warrior, could have been defeated. Well, you see, his forces included a woman so formidable she could take the head of any champion, which implies his other warriors must have been equally incredible. But here's the fascinating part. Whether she was a real person or not is almost beside the point. The fact that the storytellers of the 12th and 13th centuries could even conceive of a character like Tomo Gozen, and that audiences would accept her as a believable, if extraordinary, part of the narrative, tells us everything we need to know. It tells us that the idea of a woman as an elite frontline combatant was not seen as fantasy. It was plausible, awe-inspiring, certainly, but not impossible. The archetype existed because the reality, in some form, existed. She was the ideal, the pinnacle of what an Onna-musha could be. The legend of Tomo Gozen gave a face and a name to the thousands of anonymous women who picked up a naginata and fought for their clan, proving that a woman's place could very well be on the battlefield, at the very tip of the spear. And while Tomo might be the most famous, she was far from the only one given a name, a contemporary of hers. Another figure from the Genpei War was a woman named Hangaku Gozen, and if Tomo is the stuff of epic poetry, Hangaku feels much more like the stuff of cold, hard history. She was from a different clan, the Taira, the rivals of the Minamoto. After her side lost the war, her family's castle was besieged. Hangaku didn't just participate in the defense, she was its heart and soul. She was described as a formidable archer. Standing on the castle walls, she was a terrifying presence. The chronicles say she would loose arrows with uncanny accuracy, and that every arrow she fired found its mark, often killing multiple enemies if they were foolish enough to line up. She was, essentially, a human sniper turret, and she held the besieging army at bay, demoralizing them with her relentless, deadly precision. She was eventually wounded by an arrow and captured, but even in captivity, her reputation was so great that the shogun himself, Minamoto no Yori, was intrigued by her. He summoned her, impressed by her defiance and courage. Rather than executing her, as was the fate of most captured enemies, he ordered her to marry one of his trusted retainers. It was a strange kind of reward, a recognition of her martial prowess. You're too good a warrior to kill, so instead, you'll produce children who will hopefully inherit your skills and fight for me. It was a deeply pragmatic and very samurai way of looking at things. The story of Hangaku Gozen gives us a much clearer picture of one of the Onna-musha's most critical and historically verifiable roles, the castle defender. The open field, with its cavalry charges and grand maneuvers, was often the domain of men. It was a numbers game, a question of mass and force. But a siege was different. A siege was personal. It was a contest of will, of endurance, of resourcefulness, and in that environment skill could often trump brute strength. Imagine the scene. Your clan's castle is surrounded. The enemy army stretches as far as you can see, a patient, hungry beast waiting to devour you. Days turn into weeks. The initial terror gives way to a grim, monotonous routine. The food supplies start to dwindle. The water tastes stale. The air is thick with the smell of fear and unwashed bodies. Every day, the enemy might try something new. They might build siege towers, great lumbering wooden beasts that creep towards your walls. They might try to tunnel underneath. They might launch volleys of flaming arrows, hoping to turn your wooden home into an inferno. This is not a place for heroic one-on-one duels. This is a manager's nightmare. And who was the traditional manager of a samurai household? The wife. The Onna-musha, her skills in logistics, managing food stores, organizing servants, maintaining order, were now a matter of life and death for the entire fortress. She would oversee the rationing, the care of the wounded, the morale of the garrison. She was the COO of a company under hostile takeover, but her role was far from purely administrative. She was a commander. Standing on the ramparts, she would direct the archers. She would organize the defense of a gatehouse. She knew the castle's layout better than anyone, its strengths and its secret weaknesses. If a section of the wall was breached, she might lead a desperate countercharge, her naginata clearing a path through the enemy soldiers pouring through the gap. Think about the geometry of it. The naginata, with its long reach, is a perfect weapon for defending a narrow gateway or a flight of stairs. It keeps the enemy at a distance, turning a narrow corridor into a killing zone. They were also masters of psychological warfare. The sight of the lady of the castle, clad in armor, standing defiantly on the walls, was a powerful symbol for her own troops. It reminded them of what they were fighting for, not just some abstract concept of a lord's honor, but the very heart of their home. And for the enemy, it could be deeply unnerving. To be struck down by an arrow fired by a woman, to be repelled from a wall by a force led by a woman, it was an inversion of the natural order, a sign that the castle's spirit was unbroken. Let's talk about what they were actually wearing and carrying in these brutal encounters. The image of the Onna-musha in a beautiful flowing kimono with a sword is a product of later, more peaceful times. On the battlefield or the castle wall, practicality was everything. They wore armor, or yoroi, and for the most part, it was simply a modified version of the armor worn by men. The classic, boxy armor of the Genpei War, the Odyoroi, was designed for mounted archery. It was heavy, cumbersome, and not ideal for fighting on foot. As warfare evolved, a lighter, more form-fitting style of armor, called the domaru, became popular. This wrapped around the body and was much more flexible, making it a better choice for the Onna-musha, who might need to be more mobile, but it was still a considerable weight. Imagine strapping 30 to 40 pounds of lacquered steel plates, silk cords, and leather to your body. Now try to run, climb a ladder, or swing a 7-foot polearm for hours on end. The armor was designed to be protective, not comfortable. In the summer, it was a personal sauna. In the winter, the metal plates became ice cold, leaching the warmth from your body. The helmet, or kabuto, limited your vision and hearing, turning the already chaotic battlefield into a confusing sensory deprivation chamber. Punctuated by screams and the clang of steel, your world shrinks to what you can see through the narrow slit of your visor. And then there were the weapons. We've mentioned the naginata so many times, and for good reason. It was the great equalizer. A smaller, lighter warrior using a naginata could effectively combat a larger, stronger warrior armed with a sword. It's a simple matter of physics, leverage and reach. The long shaft allowed for powerful sweeping cuts and thrusts from a safe distance. It could be used to dismount cavalry, to trip charging enemies, or to keep multiple opponents at bay. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a zone of control. To enter the radius of a skilled naginata wielder was to invite a world of trouble. Learning to use it was a lifelong study, a dance of spinning, thrusting and cutting that was both beautiful and utterly lethal. Of course, she would also carry a sword, the katana, or the shorter wakizashi, but this was usually a secondary weapon, used if her naginata broke or if the fighting got too close, too desperate for a polearm. And tucked into her obi, her sash, would be the kaiken, the small dagger we've spoken of before. In the chaos of a breached castle or a failed battle, it was her last resort, a tool for a final defiant act of honor, a way to control her own fate when all other control was lost. It was the grim punctuation mark at the end of a warrior's life. As Japan tumbled into the chaotic century-long civil war known as the Sengoku Jidai, or the Age of Warring States, the role of the Onna-musha evolved yet again. This was a period of total war. The old rules were gone. A farmer one day could be a foot soldier, an ashigaru. The next, a minor lord could become a powerful daimyo overnight, and that same daimyo could lose his head and his entire domain the day after. Chaos was the new shogun, and its rule was absolute. In this relentless, high-stakes environment, pragmatism reigned supreme. A clan needed every asset it could muster. If the most competent person to lead a castle defense, to manage an estate, or even to lead a contingent of troops was a woman, then so be it. Survival was more important than social convention. We see the rise of female castle lords, women who inherited the leadership of their clan after their husbands or fathers were killed in battle. Women like Tachibana Jinchio. She inherited the leadership of the Tachibana clan directly from her father, a highly unusual move. When the great warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi began his campaign to unify Japan, his massive army arrived to lay siege to her castle. Jinchio, already a renowned military strategist, organized the defense. She armed herself and all the maidservants of the castle, forming her own elite unit. They stood on the walls, ready to repel the invaders. Her defiance was so formidable that it played a part in convincing the invading general to offer a peaceful settlement, rather than attempt a costly assault. She was a leader first, a warrior second, and her gender was incidental to her competence. This period also saw the rise of the ninja, or shinobi, professional spies and assassins, and while the historical record is murky by its very nature, good spies don't leave detailed records. There are many accounts and traditions of female ninja, or kunoichi. They used their gender as a weapon, a form of camouflage. No one would suspect a travelling shrine maiden, a dancer, or a servant of being a highly trained intelligence gatherer or assassin. They could infiltrate enemy castles, gather information, and sow discord in ways a male warrior never could. Their battlefield was the human mind, their weapons deception and seduction. But as the Sengoku period drew to a close, and the long enforced peace of the Tokugawa shogunate began, the world of the Onna-musha began to shrink. The constant warfare that had created the need for them was over. The samurai class was slowly being transformed from a warrior caste into a bureaucratic, administrative class. The naginata, once a weapon of war, was increasingly seen as a weapon for women to use for home defense, a tool for maintaining domestic order rather than for winning battles. The battlefield Onna-musha was fading into legend, but she didn't disappear entirely. She had one last tragic and glorious moment. It came much later, in the mid-19th century, during the Boshin War. This was the final civil war of the samurai, a clash between the old shogunate and the forces of the emperor, who were pushing for modernization and opening Japan to the west. It was a war of traditions against technology, of swords and spears against rifles and cannons. In the domain of Aizu, a stronghold of loyalty to the shogun, the samurai were preparing for a final hopeless battle against the massive modern imperial army. As the men marched out to meet the enemy, a group of women, led by a remarkable warrior named Nakano Takeiko, decided they would not simply stay behind and wait for the inevitable. Takeiko was a master of the naginata, a highly skilled martial artist. She went to the clan's military commander and demanded that they be allowed to form their own unit and fight alongside the men. Initially, he refused. It was against protocol, but Teiko and her followers were adamant. They shamed him, arguing that their skills would be wasted if they were not allowed to defend their home. Finally, he relented, and the Joshitai, the women's army, was officially formed. There were about 20 to 30 of them, armed with their naginatas and swords, taking their place in the line of battle. When the Imperial Army, with its overwhelming numbers and superior firepower, launched its attack at the Battle of Aizu, the Joshitai did not flinch. Nakano Takeko led them in a desperate, ferocious charge against a position of Imperial troops armed with rifles. Think about that for a moment. You think your day is challenging. Imagine charging on foot, armed with what is essentially a knife on a long stick, directly into the barrels of firearms. It's not a battle, it's a statement. It's an act of pure, defiant will against the cold, impersonal logic of modern warfare. They crashed into the Imperial lines with shocking force. The riflemen, caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the charge, were overwhelmed. The women of the Joshitai cut down several of them before the soldiers could effectively reload and fire, but it couldn't last. The sheer volume of fire was too great. Nakano Takeko, leading from the front, was struck in the chest by a bullet. As she lay dying, she knew what would happen. The enemy would take her head as a trophy, a symbol of their victory over the Aizu warriors. The thought was unbearable. In her last moments, she turned to her sister Yuko, who was fighting beside her, and gave her one final terrible command: "Cut off my head and bury it, so the enemy cannot have it." Her sister, with tears streaming down her face, did as she was asked. She took her sister's head and escaped the battlefield, burying it under a pine tree at a nearby temple. The story of Nakano Takeko and the Joshitai is the final heartbreaking chapter in the story of the Onna-musha on the battlefield. They were a throwback, a living echo of Tomoe Gozen, fighting in an age that no longer had a place for them. Their charge was doomed from the start, but it was not meaningless. It was the last defiant roar of a tradition that stretched back for centuries. It was a declaration that the warrior spirit was not confined to gender, and that even in the face of certain death, honor and duty were worth fighting for. The crucible of war had forged the Onna-musha, from the desperate defense of a home, to the legendary charges of the Genpei War, to the pragmatic sieges of the Sengoku Jidai, and in the end it was a new kind of war that made her obsolete on the field. The rifle and the cannon did not care for skill with a naginata, or for the steel of one's will. The battlefield had changed forever, but the warrior doesn't simply vanish when the battle ends. The spirit, the discipline, the steel forged in that crucible, it has to go somewhere. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields of the Boshin War and the long peace of a new, modern Japan began, the Onna-musha's role was forced to transform once more. She laid down her armor, but she did not lay down her blade. The field of battle moved from the muddy plains and castle walls back to the place where it had all begun, the home, the dojo, and the quiet, fiercely guarded world of the samurai woman's soul. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. The hand that wields the sword and rules the castle. But to truly understand what was lost, to grasp the sheer scale of the world that vanished with the clang of the last closing castle gate, we have to go back. Back before the age of steam and telegrams, back to a time when the world was vast and a single domain was a universe unto itself. The soul of the Onna-musha wasn't forged solely in the heat of battle. It was tempered in the long, quiet and profoundly heavy silence of responsibility, because while the battlefield was a place of explosive, brutal clarity, the truest test of her steel was when her husband, the Lord, rode out with his banners snapping in the wind, leaving her behind, leaving her not as a damsel in a tower, but as the master of it. When the dust from his departing army settled, she didn't retreat to the inner chambers to practice her poetry. She walked to the main keep, where the levers of power resided, and she took hold. In that moment she ceased to be merely the Lord's wife. She became the Castellan, the acting ruler, the Jodai, and her domain, that collection of rice paddies, forests, villages and fortifications, became her quiet kingdom. Imagine the scene, the great wooden gates of the castle, studded with iron, grown shut. The finality of that sound echoes across the courtyard. It's a sound that separates the world inside from the world outside. Outside is the chaos of campaign, the uncertainty of war, the political maneuvering of rivals. But inside, now, there is only her authority. The guards on the walls don't look to a distant battlefield for their orders anymore. They look to her. The farmers tilling the fields beyond the moat know that their petitions, their disputes, their very survival for the coming season rests in her hands. The merchants who bring salt and iron and silks to the castle town know that her seal on a document is now the only one that matters. This wasn't a ceremonial role. It wasn't a placeholder position where she simply kept the seat warm. It was a total and absolute transfer of power, sanctioned by the samurai legal codes themselves. The world of feudal Japan was one of perpetual, low-grade warfare. A lord might be gone for a single season, or he might be gone for years. He might not come back at all. The clan could not afford a power vacuum. It couldn't afford a pause in the meticulous day-to-day business of survival. And so, the woman of the house, the one trained in the same martial ethos as her husband, was the designated failsafe. She was the living embodiment of the clan's continuity. Her first and most critical domain was the kura, the storehouses. These weren't just pantries, they were the treasury, the bank, and the entire economic engine of the clan, all rolled into one. Here, the currency wasn't gold coins, not primarily. It was rice. Great woven bales of it, stacked in cool, dark, and heavily guarded buildings. Each bale represented a quantifiable unit of wealth and power. The famous koku, enough rice to feed one man for 1 year. The clan's entire standing in the world was measured by its koku. 100,000 koku lord was a regional power. 1,000,000 koku lord could dream of becoming shogun, and the woman left in charge was the chief financial officer of this entire enterprise. She held the keys, and with them, the detailed ledgers. These weren't simple grocery lists. They were breathtakingly complex documents, scrolls of rice paper filled with delicate, flowing script that tracked every single grain. She knew how much rice came in from the autumn harvest, calculated from the taxes levied on every village under her family's control. She knew the exact amount required to feed the castle's skeleton crew of guards and servants. She knew the amount that had to be set aside as seed for the next planting season. A catastrophic miscalculation here could doom the entire domain to famine. She knew how much was being lost to rot, to rats, to damp, a constant slow bleed that she had to manage with the ferocity of a battlefield commander. And this was just the beginning of the spreadsheet. From this central rice bank, all other expenses were paid. If a section of the castle wall needed repair, the cost was calculated in koku to pay the labourers and artisans. If a new consignment of arrows was needed for the armory, the fletchers were paid in koku. If a Buddhist temple on their land required its patronal donation, the priests were granted their allowance in koku. She was constantly running a series of brutal calculations. A drought might mean a poor harvest. A flood could wipe out 1/3 of their income in a single afternoon. If her husband sent a messenger back from the front lines demanding a resupply of provisions for his army, it wasn't a simple request. It was an order that could potentially drain the reserves, leaving the domain vulnerable and the people hungry. She had to make the call. She would have to weigh the immediate needs of the army against the long-term survival of the home front. Could she risk shorting the rations for the castle guard? Could she postpone the repairs on the northern watchtower? Could she demand a higher tax yield from a village that was already struggling, knowing it might push them into open revolt? These decisions, made in the quiet of a lamplit room with the sound of an abacus clicking softly, were as critical as any tactical choice made on the battlefield. A single mistake could lose the war just as surely as a failed cavalry charge, only it would be a slow, quiet, agonizing defeat measured in starving peasants and crumbling defenses. Beyond rice, she managed the other, less glamorous but equally vital streams of revenue. Perhaps the domain had a particular forest prized for its lacquer trees, or a river with rich fishing grounds. Maybe the local specialty was fine silk, woven by the village women, or pottery fired in hillside kilns. She oversaw the trade of these goods, negotiating with merchants, setting prices, and ensuring the clan's seal was respected. She dealt with the constant grinding reality of medieval economics, the threat of counterfeit currency, the hoarding of goods by opportunistic middlemen, the logistical nightmare of transporting valuable goods along roads infested with bandits. If you've ever felt the stress of managing a household budget, imagine that budget also includes payroll for 200 soldiers, a public works program to maintain irrigation ditches, and a foreign policy based on the strategic gifting of prized ceramics. This wasn't just abstract accounting. It meant she had to have an intimate, granular knowledge of the land itself. She couldn't rule from a remote office. She had to understand the rhythm of the seasons, the flow of the rivers, the character of the soil in each valley. Her role as an administrator was inextricably linked to her role as an agricultural overseer. She would receive daily reports from her stewards about the state of the crops. She'd know that the paddies in the eastern valley were prone to a certain kind of pest, or that the fields by the southern river needed their irrigation channels cleared before the rainy season began. Disputes would inevitably arise, two farmers arguing over the precise location of a boundary marker between their paddies, a matter of a few inches of mud that could mean the difference between a good harvest and a lean one. A village upstream damming a creek for their own use, depriving a village downstream of the water needed to flood their fields. These weren't trivial matters. In a world built on rice, water rights and land boundaries were matters of life and death, and it was the Onna-musha, the lady of the castle, who would sit in judgment. She would summon the concerned parties to the castle. They would stand before her, two rough farmers in straw sandals, heads bowed low on the polished wooden floor of the audience chamber. They would present their cases, perhaps with crude maps drawn in the dirt, their voices thick with the local dialect, and she, in her fine silks, would listen. She would consult the land registries, the detailed maps kept in the castle archives that her family had maintained for generations. She would question them, her voice calm and even, cutting through the emotion and getting to the heart of the matter. Her education wasn't just in literature and the tea ceremony. It was in law, precedent, and the complex web of obligations that bound the peasants to the land and the land to her clan. Her judgment would be final. There was no higher court of appeal. If she ruled that one farmer had to move his boundary marker, he moved it. If she decreed that the upstream village had to release a certain amount of water at certain times of the day, they did. Her authority was absolute. And it wasn't just about being fair, it was about maintaining order. A single unresolved dispute could fester, turning into a blood feud between families, then villages, destabilizing an entire region of her domain. Her role as judge wasn't just about justice, it was about security. She was the bedrock of social order, the guarantor of the peace that allowed the rice to grow and the clan to prosper. This brought her into constant direct contact with the common people. She was not some ethereal figure floating through the castle. She was a deeply practical and often formidable presence in their lives. She might conduct inspections of the villages, her entourage a small, efficient retinue of guards and stewards. The peasants would bow as she passed, but they would also see her with their own eyes. They would see her examining the state of a bridge, inquiring about a sick child, tasting the water from the well. She was the face of the clan, the tangible presence of power. Her reputation as either a fair and wise ruler or a cruel and capricious one was everything. A ruler beloved by her people could count on their loyalty in a time of crisis. They would hide supplies from an invading army, act as spies and fight to defend the castle. A ruler who was despised would find her domain riddled with informants and collaborators, ready to open the gates to the first enemy who promised them a lighter tax burden. Her political survival depended on this strange, delicate balance of absolute authority and carefully cultivated goodwill. Of course, her concerns extended far beyond her own borders. A domain was not an island. It was one piece on a vast, complicated game board, a go board of shifting alliances and simmering rivalries. And while her husband was away fighting one enemy, it was her job to make sure another one didn't pop up on their flank. This was the world of diplomacy, a subtle and deadly game played not with swords but with ink brushes. Her correspondence was a weapon. She would maintain a constant flow of letters with the neighbouring clans. Every character, written with a fine brush on delicate paper, was freighted with meaning. The quality of the paper, the elegance of the calligraphy, the choice of a seasonal poetic reference, all of it communicated a message. A letter to a powerful and reliable ally would be warm, filled with inquiries about the health of their family, and perhaps accompanied by a gift, a bolt of rare silk, a perfectly crafted vase. It was a gentle tending of a valuable relationship, a reminder of shared interests and mutual respect. A letter to a wavering or untrustworthy neighbour was a different art form altogether. It might be impeccably polite on the surface, a masterclass in formal language, but underneath it would carry a core of pure steel. She might casually mention the successful harvest her domain just enjoyed, a subtle way of saying, "Our storehouses are full, and we can afford a long conflict." She might inquire about a minor bandit problem near their shared border, a polite but pointed question that really meant, "I know your control over your own territory is slipping. Don't mistake my husband's absence for weakness on my part." It was the feudal Japanese equivalent of a beautifully calligraphed, "Don't even think about it." She was the hub of an intelligence network. Information was as valuable as rice. She would receive reports from spies and scouts, but also from less obvious sources. Travelling merchants who passed through her lands would be politely invited to the castle, and over cups of tea they would share gossip and news from the road. A seemingly innocent chat about trade routes could reveal which lord was massing troops, or which clan was suffering from a blight on their crops. Travelling monks and nuns who could move between hostile territories with relative freedom were often invaluable sources of information. She would offer them shelter for the night in exchange for news of the world outside her valley. She would piece together these fragments, a rumour here, a merchant's observation there, a line from a rival's letter, to form a complete strategic picture. She was playing high-stakes geopolitical chess, and her opponent's moves were often hidden in the rustle of a kimono or the whisper of a traveller's tale. Marriage politics were a huge part of this. Marriages were not about love, they were treaties signed in flesh and blood. She might be responsible for arranging the marriage of her own daughter, or negotiating for a bride for her eldest son. This was a delicate and often heartbreaking business. She would have to weigh the strategic advantage of an alliance with a powerful northern clan against the known cruelty of its lord. Was securing her border worth sacrificing her daughter's happiness, or even her safety? These were the burdens she carried. She was not just a mother, she was a dynast, and the future of her lineage often rested on the marriages she brokered. And no discussion of this kind of female power in Japan is complete without mentioning the ultimate example, the woman who so thoroughly dominated the political landscape that they called her the nun shogun, Hojo Misako. Masako's story is not just an exception, it's the towering blueprint of what a samurai woman could achieve. She was the wife of Minamoto no Yoritomo, the founder of the very first shogunate, while Yoritomo was the charismatic warrior who united the country. Masako was the shrewd political operator who helped him build the machinery of government. When Yoritomo was away on his endless campaigns, it was Masako who managed the clan's power base, who forged alliances with wavering lords, and who kept the home front secure. She was not merely his wife, she was his partner in power, his equal in intellect and ambition. But it was after Yoritomo's death that Masako's true genius for power was unleashed. Her own sons became shoguns, but they were young and inexperienced. The real power, the true authority, remained with her. Rival clans and ambitious courtiers tried to wrest control from her family, the Hojo. They saw a widow and her young sons as a weak point, a vacuum to be exploited. They could not have been more wrong. Masako outmaneuvered them all. She became a Buddhist nun after her husband's death, a common practice for widows. She shaved her head and took on the robes of a nun, a public performance of piety and retirement from worldly affairs. But it was a brilliant political move. It gave her a kind of untouchable status, freeing her from many of the social restrictions placed on women, while she continued to pull every single political string from behind the scenes. She played rival families against each other with breathtaking skill. She purged her own clan of anyone she deemed disloyal. When the emperor himself tried to overthrow the shogunate and restore his own power, it was Masako who rallied the samurai banners. Her famous speech to the wavering vassals, appealing not to abstract loyalty, but to the very real debts of gratitude they owed her late husband, is one of the great moments in Japanese history. It turned the tide, saved the shogunate, and cemented her family's control for decades. She was never officially the shogun, but everyone knew who was in charge. The nun shogun wasn't just a clever nickname, it was a statement of fact. She was the living, breathing embodiment of the Onna-musha's administrative power, a woman who proved that the hand that ruled the castle could, with enough grit and intelligence, end up ruling the entire country. Masako was exceptional, but the system that produced her was not. Thousands of other Onna-musha, on a smaller scale, performed the same duties every single day. They were the stable, unchanging center around which the chaotic world of samurai warfare revolved. And sometimes, all of their skills, their financial acumen, their legal judgment, their diplomatic cunning, were put to the ultimate test, the test of a siege. Sooner or later the game of diplomacy might fail. A rival lord, sensing an opportunity with her husband away, would decide to gamble. The watchtowers would light their signal fires. The frantic ringing of a temple bell would echo through the valley. An army, a sea of banners and spears would appear on the horizon, and the castle gates would slam shut for a very different reason. Now, the Onna-musha's role snapped into sharp military focus. All of her administrative duties were now tools of war. Her meticulous management of the kura was no longer about prosperity. It was about survival. She knew, down to the last grain, exactly how long the castle could hold out. She would immediately implement rationing. Every person inside those walls, from the highest-ranking samurai to the lowest stable hand, would be put on a strict allowance of rice and water. There was no room for error. She would walk the battlements, her presence a calming and authoritative force. Her training with the naginata was no longer a distant memory. It was a source of visible credibility. The soldiers on the walls saw not just their lord's wife, but a commander who understood their world. She would direct the defense, consulting with her captain of the guard, but making the final decisions. She would order the archers to conserve their arrows, to pick their targets carefully. She would organize the women of the castle into work crews to carry water, tend to the wounded, and even heat large cauldrons of water or oil to pour down on attackers trying to scale the walls. She was the logistician, the strategist, and the source of morale. In the long, terrifying days of a siege, hope was a resource as precious as water. She had to project an aura of unshakable confidence, even if her own heart was pounding with fear. Her calm demeanor would steady the nerves of the defenders. Her refusal to entertain any thought of surrender would give them the strength to endure another bombardment, another assault. She was fighting on two fronts. One was against the enemy outside the walls, the other was against the enemies within. Hunger, thirst, disease, and despair. She would use every tool at her disposal. Her intelligence network didn't cease to function. A single loyal peasant might be able to slip through the enemy lines at night with a message, carrying vital information about the besieging army's strength or morale. She would have to decide whether to risk sending out a sortie to disrupt their supply lines, or to conserve her own fighting strength. This was the final exam. Every skill she had ever learned was now in play. The discipline of the dojo, the strategic mind of a Go player, the financial rigor of an accountant, the legal authority of a judge, and the subtle grace of a diplomat, all of it was focused on one single desperate goal: to hold the castle, to protect the heart of the clan, to ensure there was something left for her husband to come home to. The hand that wields the sword and rules the castle were not two different hands. They were one and the same. The strength required to lift a naginata was the same bedrock strength required to sentence a man for theft. The focus needed to track an opponent in a duel was the same focus needed to balance a ledger. The courage to face death on a battlefield was the same courage needed to watch your food stores dwindle day by day and still refuse to surrender. The Onna-musha's power was not divided between the domestic and the martial. It was a holistic, seamless whole. The castle was not merely her home. It was an extension of her will, her body, her spirit. And in the long, quiet years of peace and the terrifying, brutal weeks of war, she was its unblinking, vigilant, and absolute master. Chapter 5. The Inner World. Honor, Love, and Sacrifice. And so we leave her there, as the absolute master of her physical domain, the keeper of the keys, the guardian of the grain, the unblinking eye of the fortress. But if the castle was an extension of her will, what of the will itself? What of the woman inside the armor, inside the silk, inside the silent, echoing halls of her own mind? Because beyond the walls of wood and stone, there was another fortress to defend, another domain to govern, one far more complex and treacherous than any battlefield. This was her inner world, and mastering it required a kind of courage that no amount of martial training could ever truly prepare you for. You see, for the Onna-musha, the concept of a personal life as we would understand it today was, well, a foreign luxury, almost an absurdity. Our modern world is built on the foundation of the individual, your dreams, your desires, your quest for personal fulfillment. We are encouraged from a very young age to find ourselves. For a woman of the samurai class, there was nothing to find. You already knew who you were. You were a daughter of your clan, a wife to another, a mother to the next generation. You were not a standalone entity. You were a critical, load-bearing component in a vast and ancient architecture of family, honor, and power. Your personal feelings were, in the grand calculus of the clan, a rounding error, an interesting, perhaps even beautiful detail, but ultimately irrelevant to the structural integrity of the whole. This brutal truth found its most profound expression in the matter of marriage. Romantic love, as we'd recognize it from a movie poster, was not exactly a high-priority item on the wedding planning checklist. In fact, it wasn't on the checklist at all. A samurai marriage was first and foremost a political and strategic alliance. It was the ultimate corporate merger, sealed not with signatures on a contract, but with the exchange of a daughter. A promising Onna-musha from a powerful clan was one of the most valuable assets her father possessed. She was a diplomatic envoy, a peace treaty, a living guarantee of allegiance. Her marriage could unite two warring clans, secure a vital border, or gain the favor of a more powerful lord. The process itself was a masterpiece of cold calculation. A suitable match would be identified based on status, wealth, political influence, and strategic advantage. There might be an omiai, a formal meeting, where the prospective bride and groom would see each other for the first time, often in a highly choreographed setting, surrounded by family. They would exchange polite, scripted pleasantries, sip tea, and perhaps admire a garden. It was less of a first date and more of a final inspection of a very valuable acquisition. Did she carry herself with appropriate grace? Was her education evident in her speech? Did she possess the quiet dignity expected of her station? Her own opinion on the matter was, to put it politely, not solicited. Her duty was to accept, to be the perfect, unblemished bridge between her birth family and her new one. To refuse was not just an act of personal defiance, it was an act of political sabotage. It was to dishonor her father, to insult the other clan, and to potentially plunge both families into ruin or conflict. And so she would agree. She would be married, often as a teenager, to a man she did not know, and move to a castle that was not her home, to live among people who were, until that very day, strangers. Her life from that point on was dedicated to the service of her husband's clan. Her loyalties were expected to pivot on a dime. The family she had been raised to defend and die for was now secondary. Her husband's family, the IA, was her new reality. Her purpose was to serve them, to manage their household, and, most critically, to produce an heir, preferably a male one. Now, this doesn't mean that these relationships were all loveless, miserable affairs. That's too simple a picture. Humans are adaptable creatures, and affection can bloom in the most unlikely of gardens. A bond could form, one built not on passionate romance but on shared duty, mutual respect, and the quiet companionship of navigating a very demanding life together. A husband might come to deeply respect his wife's intelligence in managing the estate, her courage in times of crisis, her counsel in matters of politics. A wife might find comfort in a husband who was kind, who valued her skills, and who treated her with the dignity her station deserved. If this blossomed into what we might call love, it was considered a pleasant but entirely optional bonus feature. The system was designed to function perfectly well without it. The marriage was successful if it produced a healthy heir and maintained the alliance. Full stop. But the emotional reality for the Onna-musha was often far more complicated. Her husband, as the head of the clan, was often permitted, and sometimes even expected, to take concubines. This wasn't necessarily seen as an act of infidelity in the modern sense, but as another strategic necessity, a way to ensure the production of more heirs and forge lesser alliances with other families. The Onna-musha, as the official wife, was expected to preside over this arrangement with unshakable composure. To show jealousy was to show a lack of discipline, a failure to understand her role. She was the matriarch of the entire household, and that included the other women and their children. Imagine the sheer force of will required to maintain perfect grace and authority in a home filled with daily living reminders that your husband's intimacy was not yours alone, to raise your son as the true heir, while treating your husband's other children by other women with fairness, knowing that any one of them could be a potential rival to your own child. It was a constant, silent psychological war, fought not with a naginata, but with a perfectly executed bow, a carefully chosen word, and an expression of serene indifference. So where in this world of rigid duty and political theatre did love reside? Where was the space for personal, intimate connection? The answer is complicated, and often hidden between the lines of poetry and in the quiet gestures of a highly ritualized life. Love, or AI, was often seen as a dangerous, destabilizing force. It was a private indulgence that could conflict with one's public duty, or giri. To prioritize love for a person over one's duty to the clan was the ultimate selfishness. And yet, of course, it happened. These were not robots. They were human beings. Perhaps love was found in the fierce, protective bond with her children. This was a socially acceptable, even encouraged form of deep affection. The love of a mother for her son, the heir, was celebrated. It was her sacred duty to mold him into a warrior, to instill in him the values of the samurai, to prepare him for a life of service, and quite possibly a very early death. This love was a strange and painful paradox. It required her to nurture her child with all her heart, while simultaneously training him to be hard enough to leave her to fight and to die honorably if called upon. She would teach him his first lessons in courage, telling him stories of heroic ancestors, and then watch as he graduated to the harsh training of the sword masters. Every ounce of her maternal instinct would have screamed to protect him, to keep him safe. Yet her duty demanded she push him towards the very danger that could take him from her. It was a love defined by the constant looming presence of sacrifice. Or perhaps intimacy was found in the subtle, coded world of art and literature. A woman of the samurai class was often highly educated. She would be skilled in calligraphy, poetry, and music. In a world where direct emotional expression was suppressed, a perfectly rendered poem could speak volumes. A waka, a short 31-syllable poem, could convey a depth of sorrow, longing, or fleeting joy that could never be spoken aloud. The choice of a flower in an arrangement, the theme of a painted scroll, these were the languages of the heart. Sharing a poem with a trusted friend or family member was an act of profound intimacy, a glimpse into that carefully guarded inner world. It was a way of saying, "I feel this," without ever upsetting the perfect, placid surface of social decorum. Friendships between women in the household could also be a source of immense comfort and solidarity. In a life of such intense pressure and isolation, the companionship of a lady-in-waiting, a sister, or even a rival-turned-confidante could be a lifeline. They alone could understand the unique burdens of their existence. They could share the anxieties of a husband away at war, the quiet grief of a child lost to illness, the subtle political maneuverings within the castle walls. These were alliances forged not for political gain, but for mutual survival in a world that demanded so much of them. But underpinning all of these relationships with her husband, her children, her friends, was the central non-negotiable pillar of their existence: honor. For the samurai, honor was not a virtue, it was the very air they breathed. It was more valuable than wealth, more important than happiness, and more precious than life itself. And for the Onna-musha, her honor was intrinsically tied to the honor of her entire clan. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket from which there was no escape. This concept is best understood through the term giri. Giri is often translated as duty, but it's more complex than that. It's a web of social obligations, a deep-seated sense of responsibility to one's name, one's ancestors, and one's lord. It dictated every single interaction, from how you bowed to a superior, to how you faced your own death. To lose face, to bring shame upon your family, was a fate literally worse than death. It was a permanent stain that could tarnish generations to come. For the Onna-musha, this meant her conduct had to be flawless, her discipline absolute. A moment of weakness, a careless word, an inappropriate emotional display, any of these could be seen as a crack in the family's armor. She was the public face of her husband's household. Her grace reflected his strength. Her composure reflected his control. Her honor was his honor. This is why the management of the household was not just about logistics. It was a performance of honor. It was about demonstrating that the clan was strong, orderly, and unshakable, even in the absence of its lord. And this brings us to the final, darkest, and perhaps most misunderstood aspect of the Onna-musha's inner world, the act of jigai. We're familiar with the male ritual of seppuku, the act of disembowelment. Jigai was the equivalent ritual for women of the samurai class, but its purpose and philosophy were distinct. While seppuku was often a way for a warrior to atone for a failure, to protest an injustice, or to avoid capture after a lost battle, jigai was almost purely an act of preserving honor. It was the final terrible guarantee against shame. If her castle was about to fall to an enemy, the Onna-musha had a final duty to perform. To be captured was the ultimate dishonor. It meant potential torture, humiliation, and sexual violence, not just against her person, but against the name of her entire clan. Her capture would be a symbol of her husband's failure, a living trophy for his enemies. And so, before the final walls were breached, the women of the castle would gather. The Onna-musha would take charge. There was a calm, solemn ritual to it. They would dress in pure white kimonos, the color of death and purity. Then, using a silk cord, they would tie their knees together. This was a crucial practical detail, ensuring that they would be found in a dignified posture after death. The instrument was not the long katana or the wakizashi of the men. It was the tanto, or the smaller kaiken, a dagger that was her constant companion, tucked into the sash of her kimono. It was as much a part of her daily attire as a piece of jewelry. She had likely carried it since her wedding day, a symbol of her commitment to her new family and a tool for her final duty. While the men targeted the abdomen, the act of jigai involved a single, swift cut across the throat, severing the carotid artery. It was designed to be quick, decisive, and final. It's tempting for us from our modern perspective to view this as a horrific act of victimhood, a final submission to a brutal patriarchal system, but to the Onna-musha, it would have been viewed as the complete opposite. It was her final act of agency, in a life where so many of her choices were made for her. Her husband, her home, her duties, the moment and manner of her death was something she, and she alone, could control. It was not an act of surrender to the enemy. It was an act of ultimate defiance. It was a statement, "You will not have me. You will not shame my family. My honor is mine, and I will take it with me, intact." Jigai could also be an act of ultimate loyalty. If her husband fell in battle, or was forced to commit seppuku, it was not uncommon for his wife to follow him in death. This was known as junshi. It was a way of demonstrating that her loyalty to him and his clan transcended life itself. It was the final devastating expression of the bond of duty that had defined her entire existence. To try and truly inhabit this mindset is almost impossible for us. We live in a world that worships survival, that sees life as the ultimate prize. For the Onna-musha, there was something more precious than life, a legacy of honor. Death was not the end, it was a transition. A dishonorable life was a permanent hell, a stain on the memory of your ancestors, and a burden on the future of your descendants. An honorable death was a final, perfect brushstroke on the portrait of your life, a gift to your family that would be remembered for generations. And so the inner world of the Onna-musha was a landscape of stark contrasts. It was a world of profound love for her children, tempered by the brutal necessity of preparing them for death. It was a world of quiet companionship, lived in the shadow of a political marriage. It was a world where deep feeling was channeled not into open displays, but into the silent language of a 31-syllable poem. And it was a world where the calm, methodical preparation for her own self-inflicted death was not an act of despair, but the ultimate act of control, the final, resolute defense of the fortress of her soul. She was the master of the castle, yes, but she was also the silent, vigilant, and absolute master of her own end. And in her world, that was the only form of freedom that truly mattered. Chapter 6. The setting sun, the peace of Tokugawa, and the fading of the steel. And so she was the master of her own end, a final, stark freedom in a world of unbreakable obligation. But what happens when the entire world that created this kind of person simply stops? What happens when the storms that forged the steel of her character cease to blow and are replaced by a long, quiet, and profoundly different kind of calm? The answer is that the sun begins to set, not with a sudden dramatic plunge into darkness, but with a slow, almost imperceptible dimming of the light, a gradual cooling of the air, until one day you look up and realize the world you once knew, the world of the warrior woman, is gone. It has slipped into the twilight, leaving behind only the ghost of its former fire. This great and terrible peace had a name. It was the Tokugawa shogunate. After centuries of the country tearing itself apart in the Sengoku period, a seemingly endless civil war that we've walked through together, one man, Tokugawa Ieyasu, finally managed to do what others had only dreamed of. He won, decisively. He unified Japan under a single military government, and in the year 1603 ushered in an era of peace that would last for over 250 years. Imagine, if you can, the sheer psychic shock of it. For generations, the only constant had been war. The only certainty was that a neighbouring lord might invade. A family might betray you. A castle might fall. Every skill, every value, every aspect of samurai life was geared towards this reality. And then, silence. The alarms stop ringing. The war drums fall quiet. The messengers with panicked news of approaching armies stop arriving. For the first time in living memory, a child could be born and grow to adulthood without ever once seeing a battlefield. For the Onna-musha, the woman of the warrior class, this was not just a change in the political weather, it was a fundamental shift in the climate of her existence. Her entire purpose had been predicated on the brutal pragmatism of war. She guarded the castle because the men were away fighting. She wielded her naginata because every able body was needed for defense. Her courage, her skill, her very lethality were assets. They were necessary. No lord, in the middle of a desperate siege, was going to complain that the woman holding the line on the castle wall was being unladylike. He was just grateful she could fight. But in the long, placid afternoon of the Tokugawa peace, this pragmatism evaporated. The need was gone. The castles were no longer under constant threat. The men weren't marching off to war. They were at home, attending to administrative duties. Suddenly, the skills of the Onna-musha were not just unnecessary, they started to look inconvenient, a little embarrassing even. A woman who could expertly handle a 17-pound polearm was in a time of profound peace, an anomaly. She was a relic of a messier, more violent time. The new era didn't need warriors, it needed managers, it needed bureaucrats, and it had a very, very specific and much quieter job in mind for its women. To enforce this new reality, the Tokugawa shogunate needed more than just armies and laws. They needed an idea, a powerful, all-encompassing social philosophy that would justify their rule and keep everyone, quite literally, in their place. They found the perfect tool for the job in something called Neo-Confucianism. Now, this wasn't a new invention. It was a philosophy that had existed for centuries, originating in China, but the Tokugawa regime adopted it and promoted it with the fervour of a modern corporation rolling out a new mandatory HR policy. And this policy was all about one thing: order, a rigid, unshakable social hierarchy. Neo-Confucianism taught that a stable society was like a perfectly structured family. Everyone had a role, and happiness and harmony were achieved when everyone fulfilled that role without question. At the very top was the ruler, the shogun, who was like the father of the nation. Beneath him were the daimyo, the lords, beneath them the samurai, then the farmers, the artisans, and finally, at the bottom, the merchants. And within this grand structure, every smaller unit, every family, was a miniature reflection of the same hierarchy. The father, the husband, was the absolute authority. His word was law, and beneath him, of course, was his wife. This philosophy laid out what were known as the 3 obediences for a woman. As a girl, she must obey her father. As a wife, she must obey her husband. And as a widow, she must obey her eldest son. There was no fourth option. There was no chapter in the manual for being in charge of yourself. The Tokugawa government looked at this beautifully organized top-down system and saw it for what it was, the ultimate tool for social control. It was a way to justify their power and to ensure that the chaos of the Sengoku period could never ever happen again. They began to systematically promote this ideology through education, through law, through art. The wild, unpredictable, ambitious samurai who had defined the age of war were to be tamed. They were to be turned from warriors into a hereditary class of scholar administrators, and their wives, the Onna-musha who had fought beside them, were to be tamed even more thoroughly. This new ideology found its most famous expression in a book that became essential reading for women of the samurai class. It was called the Onna-daigaku, or the Greater Learning for Women. You can think of it as the ultimate guide to the new approved model of samurai womanhood, and it was, let's just say, a significant departure from the old ways. The Onna-daigaku didn't speak of valor or courage in the face of the enemy. It spoke of humility, of quietness, of obedience. It taught that a woman's greatest virtues were things like sewing and weaving, not skill with a blade. It stated, quite explicitly, that a woman's character was inherently foolish, fickle, and inferior to a man's, and that only through constant, unquestioning obedience to her husband could she hope to achieve a kind of borrowed grace. It advised a wife to look upon her husband as if he were her lord, to serve him with a devotion that bordered on worship. It went into excruciating detail. A woman should not be loud, she should not be jealous, she should rise early and go to bed late, dedicating all her waking hours to the smooth running of the household. Her world was to be the inner chambers of the home, the public sphere. The world of politics, of commerce, of art, and certainly of war, was the exclusive domain of men. The book was less a piece of helpful advice, and more a blueprint for a cage, a very elegant silk-lined cage, to be sure, but a cage nonetheless. And what of the naginata, the iconic weapon of the Onna-musha, the steel extension of her will? What happens to a weapon when there is no longer a war? It becomes a symbol. It becomes an ornament. During the Tokugawa period, the naginata underwent a profound transformation. It didn't disappear entirely, but its purpose was completely rewritten. It became a required part of a samurai daughter's dowry. When she married and went to her husband's home, she would take a beautifully lacquered naginata with her. But this was not the heavy, functional, war-tested weapon of her ancestors. It was often lighter, more decorative, and its purpose was no longer to repel invaders from the castle walls. Its new official purpose was to defend the honor of the home. But this was a purely symbolic duty. It was a visual reminder of her samurai heritage, of the stoic spirit she was expected to possess. It was a promise that she would instill these values in her children. The idea of her actually using it in a real fight became almost unthinkable, a breach of decorum. The weapon was still there, but it had been silenced. The steel was now wrapped in silk, a piece of ceremonial furniture. Its presence in the home was a quiet testament to a past that was being actively, deliberately rendered obsolete. You can see the change in the very posture of women in art from the period. The fierce, dynamic figures of women in battle from earlier scrolls are replaced by images of serene, passive figures, arranged in beautiful kimonos, practicing calligraphy, or arranging flowers. The ideal was no longer strength but grace, not resilience but refinement. The education of a samurai daughter shifted. She still learned to read and write, of course, but the emphasis was on poetry, on music, on the tea ceremony. These were the skills of a cultured wife who could be a credit to her husband's social standing. Martial training, if it happened at all, was a highly ritualized, almost dance-like practice, stripped of its lethal intent. It was about cultivating inner discipline, not about preparing for a life-or-death struggle. This was, in many ways, an existential crisis for the entire samurai class. Not just the women. The male samurai were in a strange position themselves. They were still the ruling elite. They still wore their two swords, the daisho, as a badge of their status. But what did it mean to be a warrior in an age without war? The average Tokugawa samurai's life was not one of daring charges and heroic last stands. It was one of paperwork. He was a civil servant. His days were spent in a castle, yes, but he wasn't guarding the ramparts. He was in an office, meticulously recording rice yields, approving permits, and adjudicating minor disputes. The deadliest thing he might face in a given month was a stern reprimand from his superior. There were still dojos, of course, and the martial arts were still practiced, but they became just that, arts, systems of self-improvement and spiritual development, divorced from the grim reality of the battlefield. The samurai class as a whole was being domesticated. The government wanted them to be a stable, predictable administrative body, not a volatile warrior caste itching for a fight. And if the men were being turned into bureaucrats, what hope was there for the Onna-musha? She was a casualty of this taming process. The new social order had no place for her. A woman who was her husband's equal on the training ground, or even his superior, was a threat to the perfect, neat hierarchy that Neo-Confucianism demanded. The very idea of it was disruptive, and so her story was quietly edited. The tales of Tomo Gozen and Hangaku Gozen and the other great warrior women of the past were recontextualized. They were presented as aberrations, as strange and mythical exceptions to the natural order of things, not as role models to be emulated. They were fascinating, perhaps, like tales of dragons or ghosts, but they belonged to a distant, almost barbaric past. The new heroines were different. The stories that were celebrated were those of immense domestic loyalty. The wife who faithfully waits for her husband for decades. The wife who sells herself into servitude to pay for her husband's education or his family's debts. And most powerfully, the wife who, upon her husband's death, or in the face of unbearable dishonor, commits jigai with perfect stoic resolve. And here we see the final, tragic turn of the screw. The one martial art that remained not only permissible but actively encouraged for a woman was the art of ritual suicide. The use of the tanto, the small dagger, was still taught to samurai daughters, but its purpose was now almost entirely inward-looking. Her martial skill was to be directed at herself. The fortress she was charged with defending was no longer the stone walls of a castle, but the abstract concept of her family's honor, and the ultimate defense of that fortress was her own self-destruction, the mastery of her own end, which for her ancestors had been the final desperate act of control in a world of chaos and war, was now her primary prescribed role. It was the last vestige of her warrior heritage, turned inward and domesticated. Her courage was no longer to be displayed on the battlefield, but in the quiet, lonely moments in a room with a small, sharp blade. She was still expected to be made of steel, but that steel was to be used not to fight for her life, but to perfectly and gracefully end it. And so, the Onna-musha faded from the stage of Japanese history. She didn't fall in a blaze of glory on some final, hopeless battlefield. She was simply retired. She was thanked for her service during the messy, unpleasant business of the civil wars, and then politely shown the door to the inner chambers of the house. Her armor was put into storage. Her naginata was polished and hung on a wall. She was handed a manual for a new life, a life of quiet obedience and domestic duty. She was told that her new battleground was the household, her new enemies were dust and disorder, and her greatest victory was the silent, stoic endurance of her fate. The world had changed. Peace, ironically, had been her undoing. The stability that her ancestors had fought and died for had created a society that no longer had a place for a woman like her. The setting sun of the Tokugawa era cast long shadows, and within those shadows the figure of the female warrior quietly, gracefully, and inexorably disappeared. The age of steel had given way to an age of silk, and the transition was absolute. Her world, once defined by the clang of swords and the roar of battle, was now filled with the rustle of fabric, the soft whisper of a brush on paper, and the profound, unshakable quiet of the long piece. Chapter 7. Echoes in Eternity. Legacy in Myth and Modernity. But a story, you see, is not like a sword. You can't simply oil it, wrap it in silk, and place it in a lacquered box to be forgotten. A story has a life of its own. It's a ghost, and in that profound, unshakable quiet of the long piece, the ghosts of the past began to speak. The rustle of fabric, at first, might have sounded like the wind, but soon it began to take on the cadence of a narrative. The whisper of a brush on paper wasn't just forming characters, it was resurrecting phantoms, and the silence, well, the silence was the perfect canvas. It was the vast, empty stage upon which the echoes of a louder, more violent time could finally be heard, not as the terrifying clang of steel, but as something far more enduring, a legend. The Onna-musha, the woman warrior, had disappeared from the battlefield. She had vanished from the daimyo's court and the castle roster, but in doing so she had simply moved into a new, more powerful domain, the imagination. Her story was no longer bound by the messy, inconvenient truths of history, of mud and blood and politics. It was free to be polished, to be perfected, to be transformed into a myth that could serve new purposes for a new Japan. The woman of flesh and blood was gone, but the idea of her was just getting started. Her first resurrection came not in a history text, but in an epic. History books are for scholars. They are quiet things, filled with dates and names that sit patiently on a page. Epics are for everyone. They are meant to be performed, to be sung, to be felt, and the great epic of this age was the tale of the Heike. If you imagine Japanese history as a vast library, the tale of the Heike isn't a dusty tome in the back. It's the blockbuster movie franchise playing on a loop in the grand entrance hall. For centuries, it was the primary way people understood the dramatic, nation-shaping civil war between the Taira and Minamoto clans. And it wasn't just read, it was performed by blind monks called Biwa Hoshi, who would travel the country, chanting the verses to the mournful, resonant twang of a lute-like instrument, the biwa. Imagine sitting in a circle, the only light from a flickering lamp, as a monk begins to chant. His voice fills the room, and the music of the biwa underscores the drama, the sorrow, the glory. This wasn't just a history lesson. It was prestige television for the Kamakura period. It was how you got the news, the drama, the celebrity gossip of an era long past. And it is here, in this grand, sweeping and profoundly sad story, that the most famous Onna-musha of all time makes her grand entrance, Tomo Gozen. The Heike describes her not just as a warrior, but as a marvel of nature. She is a match for 1,000 warriors ready to confront a demon or a god. She is a peerless archer, a master horsewoman who can ride down the steepest slopes, and when it comes to the sword, her strength is legendary. The text lingers on her beauty too: fair skin, long black hair, a lovely face. The storytellers who crafted this tale understood something crucial about legends. They need to be larger than life. Tomo wasn't just competent, she was superlative. She wasn't just a soldier, she was an icon. She is introduced as the perfect warrior, who also happens to be a perfect woman, a combination designed to capture the imagination completely. But what makes her story so powerful, so sticky in the cultural memory, is its ending, or rather, its lack of one. In her final appearance, after a dazzling display of her prowess where she takes the head of an enemy champion, her lord Yoshinaka tells her to flee the battlefield. He is about to face his end, and he feels it would be shameful to die with a woman by his side. It's a complex, heartbreaking moment. After everything she has done, after proving herself 1,000 times over, her gender is suddenly the only thing that matters. And so Tomo Gozen, the peerless warrior, obeys. She rides away from the battle, and that's it. She vanishes from the epic. She vanishes from history. The storytellers left her fate a perfect, beautiful blank. Did she become a nun? Did she wander the earth? Did she avenge her master? The not knowing is the point. It transformed her from a historical figure, and her actual existence is still debated by historians, which only adds to the mystique into a vessel for imagination. She became a story that anyone could finish for themselves. She wasn't just a character anymore, she was a prompt, and for centuries, Japan would take that prompt and run with it, reimagining her, retelling her story, ensuring that while she may have ridden off the page of the Heike, she would never ride out of the nation's heart. She was the first great echo, the one that proved how a woman warrior could be more powerful in memory than she ever was in life. As the long peace of the Edo period settled in, and the memory of civil war faded further, the way people engaged with these stories began to change. The mournful chant of the Baiwa monk gave way to a new, vibrant, and altogether more commercial art form, the ukiyo-e woodblock print. We can think of these as the posters, the comic books, and the celebrity pin-ups of their day. They were mass-produced, affordable, and they depicted the pictures of the floating world, beautiful courtesans, famous kabuki actors, and dramatic scenes from history and myth. And in this world of ink and paper, the Onna-musha found a spectacular new stage. The process itself is a kind of gentle, rhythmic lullaby. Imagine the artist, hunched over a block of fine-grained cherry wood, meticulously carving away everything that is not the image, the soft scrape of the knife, the whisper of wood shavings falling away, then the application of ink, the careful laying of a sheet of handmade paper, and the patient, firm pressure of a special tool called a baron, rubbing the back of the paper to transfer the image, for each colour, a new block perfectly aligned. It's a process of immense skill and patience, a quiet and meditative act that resulted in images of explosive drama. And the Onna-musha were perfect subjects. Artists like Yoshitoshi or Kuniyoshi reached back into the annals of history and myth and pulled these women into the vivid, full-colour present. Here was Empress Jingu, the semi-legendary ruler who supposedly conquered Korea while pregnant, depicted not as a stoic monarch, but as a fierce warrior goddess, her robes flowing like water, her eyes blazing with divine purpose. Here was Hangaku Gozen, the historical archer who defended a fortress with uncanny skill, shown standing atop the battlements, drawing her bow against a tide of enemies, a figure of impossible defiance. And of course there was Tomo Gozen. In print after print, she is captured in her most dramatic moments, riding into battle, wrestling a man from his horse, or in that final poignant scene, taking a head before vanishing into the mists of legend. But the artists of the floating world weren't historians. They were entertainers. The armour they drew was often fantastically ornate, far more elaborate than anything worn in the 12th century. The poses were pure drama, designed for maximum visual impact, not historical accuracy. The faces were idealized, conforming to the aesthetics of the day. This wasn't a corruption of history, it was a celebration of it. It was taking a story that had been told in words and sound, and giving it a dynamic visual identity. For a common person in Edo, a city now at peace, these prints were a window into a more heroic, more exciting past. You could buy a print of Tomo Gozen for a few coins, and paste it to a screen in your home. She wasn't just a character in a story anymore. She was a decorative hero, a piece of art, a symbol of a kind of strength and glory that seemed to belong to a different world. The prints solidified her image, making her instantly recognizable. They turned history into pop culture. And in doing so, they ensured that the Onna-musha wouldn't just be remembered, she would be seen, admired, and hung on the wall. She became quite literally a household name. From the quiet contemplation of a woodblock print, our journey into the legacy of the Onna-musha takes us into the noise, the colour, and the spectacular drama of the kabuki theatre. If ukiyo-e prints were the posters, kabuki was the live-action, pyrotechnic-filled summer blockbuster. Emerging in the Edo period, kabuki was theatre for the people. It was loud, emotional, and visually stunning, a stark contrast to the restrained and subtle no-theatre favoured by the samurai elite. Kabuki was all about grand gestures, elaborate costumes, and stories of love, betrayal, revenge, and heroism. And naturally, the tales of the ancient warrior women were ripe for adaptation. Picture yourself in a bustling theatre in Edo. The air is thick with the smell of lamp oil and food from the nearby stalls. The audience is a lively mix of merchants, artisans, and townsfolk, all packed together, ready for a show. The stage itself is a marvel of ingenuity, with trapdoors, revolving platforms, and intricate sets. When the play begins, it's a full-on sensory assault. Music from shamisen, flutes and drums punctuates the action. The actors, with their faces painted in dramatic white makeup with bold lines of red and black to denote their character, speak in a stylized, almost melodic way. On this stage, the Onna-musha was transformed once again. She was no longer just a figure from a chanted epic or a static image on a print. She was a living, breathing character, albeit one of an exaggerated and theatrical nature. Interestingly, all kabuki roles, both male and female, were played by men. The actors who specialized in female roles, the Onnagata, spent their entire lives perfecting the art of feminine grace and movement. So when an Onnagata played a warrior woman like Tomo Gozen, the result was a fascinating blend of stylized femininity and explosive martial prowess. In a kabuki play, the story of the Onna-musha would be stretched and reshaped to fit the conventions of the theatre. A minor historical detail might be blown up into a major plot point. Love interests might be invented, betrayals added, and motivations clarified in long emotional monologues. The focus was always on the peak moments of drama. The audience wanted to see the famous scenes they knew from the epics and prints brought to life. They wanted to see Tomo Gozen's final, heartbreaking farewell to her lord. They wanted to see her perform a kata, a stylized dance of combat, with a naginata, and they wanted to see the maive. This is a signature element of kabuki, where at the climax of a scene, an actor freezes in a powerful, picturesque pose, often crossing one eye, holding the position for a moment as the audience shouts its approval. Imagine the actor playing Hangaku Gozen, having just fired a crucial arrow, freezing in a pose of absolute defiance, her body a perfect expression of strength and determination. This is the moment that gets captured, the emotional snapshot that everyone came to see. The kabuki Onna-musha was a spectacle. She was a role, an archetype. She could be the loyal wife, who takes up her husband's spear to defend their home, or the vengeful spirit of a wronged woman seeking justice, or the peerless hero fighting alongside men. The historical accuracy was, to put it politely, a secondary concern. The goal was emotional truth, not factual reality. The theatre took the legend that the storytellers and artists had built and gave it a voice, a body, and a grand, dramatic stage. It cemented the Onna-musha not as a person who once lived, but as a character who would live forever in the repertoire of Japanese drama, ready to be resurrected night after night for a cheering crowd. And then, the world changed. The long, peaceful isolation of the Edo period came to a sudden, jarring end. The 20th century arrived, bringing with it technologies and ideas that would reshape Japan and the world. And with these changes came a new storytelling medium, one that could capture motion and sound and project it onto a giant screen in a dark room. Film. The Onna-musha, who had already conquered the worlds of spoken epics, woodblock prints and the theatrical stage, was about to make her cinematic debut. In the early to mid-20th century, the golden age of Japanese cinema, the samurai genre, or chanbara, became a dominant force. Directors like Akira Kurosawa elevated these stories into high art. Yet, in this new landscape, the Onna-musha often found herself in a slightly different role. For a long time, she was frequently relegated to the sidelines. She was the loyal wife, the steadfast sister, the tragic victim, characters who might display incredible inner strength and fortitude, but who rarely wielded a blade in the thick of battle. The focus was overwhelmingly on the male samurai, their codes, their conflicts, their existential angst. The woman warrior of the epics seemed to have been, for a time, put back in her box. But a good story, as we know, refuses to stay quiet. Slowly, then with increasing confidence, the Onna-musha began to carve out her space on the silver screen. She appeared in historical epics, often as a supporting character whose martial skill provided a shocking and dramatic twist. She was the surprise defender of a besieged castle, the last line of defense when all the men had fallen. These portrayals, while powerful, often treated her as an exception, a marvel, rather than a natural part of the warrior class. She was the woman who fought like a man, a phrase that, while meant as a compliment, subtly reinforced the idea that her role was an anomaly. As the decades wore on, however, and as cultural conversations around the world began to shift, so too did the portrayal of the Onna-musha. She began to move from the background to the foreground. She became the protagonist. Films started to explore not just her battles, but her inner life. What did it mean to be a woman in a world defined by masculine codes of honor? How did she navigate the expectations of her family and society, while also honing her skills as a warrior? The camera could do something the woodblock print and the kabuki stage couldn't. It could show the quiet, intimate moments, the silent polishing of a blade, the determined look in her eyes as she trained, the conflict and exhaustion on her face after a battle. The Onna-musha in film became a vessel for contemporary ideas. She could be a symbol of feminist empowerment, a woman breaking free from the constraints of a patriarchal society. She could be a figure of national pride, representing the enduring spirit of Japan's past. She could also be a tragic figure, a woman whose strength and skill ultimately couldn't save her from the harsh realities of her time. The cinematic Onna-musha was complex, nuanced, and deeply human. She was no longer just a legend, she was a character study, a moving, breathing person whose struggles felt real and relatable to a modern audience, even if they were set centuries in the past. The echo had gained a new kind of resonance, a psychological depth that made her story more powerful than ever before. From the shared darkness of the movie theatre, the story of the Onna-musha migrated to an even more personal space. The vibrant, dynamic pages of manga and the flickering, colourful screens of anime. If film gave her psychological depth, these new mediums gave her boundless freedom. In the world of ink and animation, the laws of physics are optional, and historical accuracy can be a suggestion rather than a rule. Here, the legend of the woman warrior was not just retold, it was completely and utterly reimagined. Manga and anime have a unique visual language, capable of conveying intense action and deep emotion in a single stylized panel or a fluid sequence of animation. In this environment, the Onna-musha exploded. She was no longer bound by the limitations of a human actor or a special effects budget. Her naginata could slice through enemies with impossible speed and grace. Her archery could be a thing of superhuman precision. She could leap over castle walls, confront giant demons, and lead armies into fantastical battles. The archetypal warrior woman was fused with the boundless energy of modern Japanese pop culture. What's fascinating is how these mediums used the Onna-musha to explore a huge range of themes. In some stories, she is the stoic, historically grounded hero, a figure of discipline and tradition. Her tale a serious exploration of the Bushido code. She might be a wandering ronin, seeking redemption in a gritty, realistic depiction of feudal Japan. Her struggles are internal as much as external, grappling with her identity and place in the world. In other stories, she becomes a vessel for pure fantasy. She might be reborn in a magical world, using her samurai skills to fight dragons and wizards. Her armor might be infused with mystical powers, her sword a legendary artifact. She could be part of a sci-fi epic, a futuristic samurai piloting a giant robot, her naginata now a massive beam weapon. Here, the Onna-musha is less a historical figure and more of an aesthetic, a set of cool signifiers, the armor, the weapons, the warrior spirit, that can be plugged into any genre imaginable. This is where her legacy becomes truly global. Through manga and anime, the image of the Japanese woman warrior traveled far beyond Japan's shores. For millions of people around the world, their first introduction to this idea came not from a history book or a Kurosawa film, but from a comic book or a cartoon. She became an international icon of female strength, and she was adapted to reflect the values of her new audiences. She became a champion for the underdog, a protector of the innocent, a symbol of rebellion against unjust authority. The quiet, disciplined woman of history, who lived and died by a strict code of loyalty to her lord, was now a free agent. She could be anything the artist or writer wanted her to be. Her echo was no longer just bouncing off the walls of Japanese culture, it was reverberating across the entire planet, inspiring new stories, new art, and new generations of fans who saw in her a timeless and universal appeal. The Woman of Steel had become a woman of ink and light, infinitely adaptable and more popular than ever. And finally, we arrive at the ultimate evolution of the legend, the final frontier of her legacy, the digital world of video games. Here, the journey of the Onna-musha comes full circle in a remarkable way. For centuries, people had listened to her story, looked at her image, watched her on a stage or a screen. They were observers of her legend. In a video game, you don't just watch the Onna-musha, you become her. You are the one who picks up the controller. Your fingers guide her movements. You decide when to dodge, when to parry, when to strike. You equip her armor, choose her weapons, and guide her through vast, beautifully rendered landscapes of feudal Japan. The sensory experience is complete. You hear the crunch of snow under her feet, the whistle of an arrow flying past her ear, the satisfying clang of her blade meeting an enemy's. You feel the tension of a duel, the thrill of a victory, the frustration of defeat. The Onna-musha of the video game is the culmination of all the versions that came before. She has the epic heroism of the tale of the Heike, the stunning visual design of an ukiyo-e print, the dramatic flair of a kabuki play, and the narrative depth of a feature film. She is an interactive myth. Developers and designers spend countless hours researching historical armor and fighting styles to create a sense of authenticity, even while placing her in stories filled with mythological beasts and magical elements. In this digital realm, her story is no longer linear. It's a sprawling, open world where you, the player, can explore her life and her world at your own pace. You can spend hours just wandering through a bamboo forest, watching the light filter through the leaves. You can engage in side quests, helping villagers, and learning more about the culture of her time. The Onna-musha is no longer just a warrior. She is an explorer, a diplomat, a detective. Her character is defined by your actions. This represents a profound shift in how we interact with history and legend. The past is no longer something to be passively received. It's a world to be inhabited. When you play as an Onna-musha, you are engaging with her legacy in the most direct way possible. You are keeping her spirit alive, not by retelling her story, but by living it, one digital footstep at a time. The real woman of the past, who may have spent her days in quiet discipline, training and waiting for a call to duty, has been transformed into an avatar of action and adventure for millions. It's a strange and beautiful paradox. The further we get from the historical reality of the Onna-musha, the more present and powerful her idea becomes. From a figure who quietly disappeared into the peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, she has echoed through time, her form changing with each new medium, her story adapting to the needs of each new generation. She was a voice in a chanted poem, a splash of colour on a piece of paper, a dramatic pose on a wooden stage, a flicker of light on a silver screen, a dynamic drawing on a page, and finally, a digital ghost you can inhabit. Each incarnation stripped away a little more of the historical fact, but added a new layer to the legend. The woman herself, the one who actually lived, is lost to us. We can't know her thoughts, her fears, her everyday reality. All we have are the echoes she left behind. But these echoes have created something else, an archetype, a powerful, enduring symbol of female strength, resilience, and grace under pressure. She is a testament to the idea that a story, well told, can be stronger than steel and more lasting than any dynasty. And so, even now, in the quiet of a darkened room, as you get ready to rest, you can still hear her, not the clang of her sword, but the soft, persistent whisper of her legend, a story that will likely never fall silent,